Welcome to Turning Points, the place where a single image, moment, or forgotten detail can unravel the darkest truths buried in our past. Picture this. You're rummaging through an old attic and stumble upon a dusty portrait of a charming 4-year-old boy. Soft curls frame his face. His hazel eyes shine with innocence, and his tiny hands clutch a crimson rose as he stands dressed in deep burgundy velvet, a scene straight out of a wealthy Alabama household in the 1850s. For more than a century and a half, this painting circulated among collectors who admired it as a wholesome relic of early American life. But the illusion shattered when restorers gently removed layers of varnish and uncovered what had been deliberately hidden: an iron neck collar, shackles camouflaged beneath delicate lace sleeves, and faint writing on the canvas identifying him as property, not family. His name was Thomas. Born into slavery in 1851, he never had the childhood that portrait pretended to show. It wasn't created to preserve a memory. It was crafted to display him for sale. Tonight on Turning Points, we peel back the lies and step into the devastating truth behind a painting that changed everything once its real story came to light. Let's begin. Before we step into the nightmare that hides behind one of the most deceptive smiles in American history, let me take you back to a quiet afternoon in the spring of 2012, to a low-slung auction gallery tucked away on a side street in Richmond, Virginia, a city that still breathes the ghosts of the Confederacy in every brick and cobblestone. The room smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint mustiness that clings to anything that has spent a century in an attic. Folding chairs had been set out in uneven rows, occupied mostly by local dealers in khakis and tweed, a handful of elderly collectors clutching rolled-up catalogues, and one or two out-of-state pickers hoping to flip something on eBay, and a young couple who had wandered in mostly because the air conditioning felt good on a humid Virginia day. Overhead, a lazy ceiling fan pushed the air around without really cooling anything. Lot 47 was announced in the bored nasal cadence that auctioneers fall into when they've been at it for hours. Next up, folks, we have a mid-19th century American school portrait of a young child, oil on canvas, 30 by 25 inches, relined, some craquelure, old repairs but a sweet face, very much in the style of the Southern portrait tradition. Let's start the bidding at $800. $800, anyone? A small rectangular painting was carried out by a white-gloved assistant and propped on the easel. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, it looked almost too perfect, too doll-like. The boy in the portrait couldn't have been more than 4 years old. His skin was porcelain pale, with just a hint of rose at the cheeks. His eyes, an almost unnatural bright hazel that caught the light like polished glass. Soft brown curls framed his face and spilled over the collar of a rich burgundy velvet suit trimmed in cream lace. One chubby hand rested on a leather-bound book. The other held a single red rose. He was seated on an expensive-looking chair draped with emerald fabric, and behind him, barely suggested in the background, was the hint of a column and draped curtain, the standard props that told 19th century viewers, "This child comes from money." The smile was the thing that stopped people mid-breath. It wasn't the stiff, tight-lipped smile you see in most antebellum portraits, where children look like miniature adults who have already been told 100 times to sit still or else. This boy's mouth curved upward in genuine delight, lips slightly parted, as if he had just heard a secret joke or was about to burst into laughter. There was a dimple in his left cheek, and the painter had caught the faintest glint of tiny milk teeth. It was impossible not to smile back at him. A ripple of soft awes moved through the room. Someone whispered, "He looks like a little prince." Another voice answered, "Reminds me of those old Victorian Christmas cards." The auctioneer, sensing interest, perked up. Bidding climbed quickly. 800, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. A dealer in the back row raised his paddle for 2,500, then 3,000. A woman near the front, wearing pearls and a navy blazer, hesitated, looked at her husband, then nodded. 3,200, 35, 4,000. The hammer finally fell at $4,250 plus buyer's premium to the couple with pearls. A bargain, everyone agreed, for such a charming piece of southern folk art. After the sale, the painting was carried to the holding area, where new owners signed paperwork and arranged shipping. The woman who had won it ran her fingers lightly over the frame, an ornate gilt affair that had been regilded at some point in the 1920s, judging by the slightly brassy tone. "We'll hang it in the nursery when the baby comes," she told her husband. "It feels happy." The husband laughed and kissed the top of her head. "As long as it's not haunted," he joked. Everyone around them chuckled. Nobody noticed the way the boy's painted eyes seemed to follow them as they walked away. The painting spent the next 9 years moving through the normal life cycle of mid-level antiques. The couple displayed it for a while, then stored it when they renovated. Eventually, they downsized and consigned it to a regional auction house in Maryland. There, it caught the eye of a dealer from Philadelphia who specialized in early American portraits. He paid $6,000 for it in 2017, hung it in his booth at an antique show in New York, marked it $12,500, and sold it 6 months later to a collector in Connecticut who loved children in period costume. By this point, the canvas had picked up a few more gallery labels on the back, a couple of condition reports, and a handwritten note in faded ink that read, "Portrait of Master Edmund Carrington, circa 1855, attributed to itinerant artist working in Virginia." Nobody questioned the identification. Why would they? The boy looked white. The clothing screamed wealth. The pose and props were textbook upper-class portraiture. The name Edmund Carrington sounded plausibly aristocratic. The painting had all the signifiers that 19th-century Southern elites used to broadcast status, and 20th-century collectors had been trained to read those signifiers the same way. Velvet suit, check. Leather-bound book as a symbol of education and refinement, check. Rose for innocence and beauty, check. Slight contrapposto in the way he sat, showing off the expensive fabric, check. It fit perfectly into the narrative everyone already believed about the antebellum South, a gracious, refined world of columned mansions and happy children who never had to worry about anything more serious than which pony to ride that afternoon. Even the condition of the painting helped sell the fantasy. Over the decades, layers of yellowed varnish and centuries of coal smoke and tobacco residue had softened the details into a warm golden haze. The boy's face glowed like something out of a dream. Grime had settled into the cracks of the paint, giving the surface a patina that whispered, "Old, valuable, authentic." Restorers had been careful not to over-clean it. Too bright, and it would look fake. Just clean enough to see that radiant smile, but still sleepy enough to feel like you had discovered buried treasure. The cracks in the paint craquelure formed a delicate web across the canvas like the wrinkles on an old woman's hand, lending gravitas. Everything about it said, "I am exactly what I appear to be." Art historians who examined it during those years wrote short, comfortable paragraphs in auction catalogues. Charming portrait of a young gentleman, Southern school, third quarter 19th century, exceptionally engaging expression, possibly commemorating a birthday or christening. The rose may indicate the child's nickname or family crest. They compared it to known portraits of children from Charleston, Mobile, and Natchez, boys who grew up to inherit plantations and fight for the Confederacy and have their own statues erected a century later. No one thought to ask why the boy's hands looked slightly too large for his age, or why the lace at his cuffs seemed a fraction too pristine compared to the wear on the velvet, or why the book he held had no title on the spine. Those were minor quirks, easily dismissed as the idiosyncrasies of an unknown regional artist. Beneath the varnish, beneath the grime, beneath 160 years of deliberate blindness had accumulated like sediment. Every generation that owned the painting saw what they wanted to see: innocence, privilege, beauty untainted by the horrors happening just beyond the manicured lawn in the background. They saw a little white boy who would never know hunger, who would never be whipped for learning to read, who would never be sold away from his mother before he was old enough to spell his own name. They saw everything the South wanted the world to believe about itself, and nothing that might force them to question that myth. And the boy in the portrait kept smiling. He smiled when he was sold for $4,000 in Virginia. He smiled when he was priced at $12,000 in New York. He smiled when he hung above a fireplace in Connecticut, while the new owners toasted with champagne. He smiled through every dinner party where guests complimented his sweet little face and asked if he was an ancestor. He smiled while the world patted itself on the back for finding him charming, because that was what he had been painted to do. That smile wasn't joy, it wasn't even happiness, it was marketing. It was the single most brutal lie ever brushed onto canvas in the name of profit, and for 150 years it worked perfectly. It convinced judges and scholars, collectors and curators, mothers and decorators that they were looking at privilege incarnate. Until one day in 2021, when a conservator in a quiet studio in Washington, D.C., began the slow, careful process of removing those protective layers of grime and lies, one microscopic swab at a time. But that part of the story comes later. For now, the portrait still belonged to the fantasy. It was still just a painting of a smiling boy, a little prince in velvet, a child who everyone agreed must have lived a golden life in a world that no longer existed. And the smile never wavered, not once, not even when the truth began to bleed through the cracks. The painting arrived at the conservation studio on a grey Tuesday morning in February 2021, wrapped in acid-free tissue and cradled inside a custom crate that smelled faintly of cedar and the previous owner's lavender sachets. It was booked in under the nondescript inventory number NAHE 2021.1117 because no one at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture yet realized what they had. The referral had come through a circuitous route. A Connecticut collector had decided to donate a portion of his collection for a tax write-off. An appraiser had flagged the portrait as possibly of interest because of its unusually engaging expression, and a junior curator doing routine intake had noticed that the back of the canvas bore an old wax seal that looked suspiciously like the mark used by a known Alabama plantation family. Still, expectations were low. At most, they thought they might be looking at a minor work by a traveling artist who had passed through the Deep South in the 1850s. Routine cleaning, basic stabilization, maybe a new stretcher, and then into storage with the thousands of other antebellum portraits the museum already owned. The conservator assigned to the project was Dr. Elena Marquez, a woman in her late 30s, with a reputation for almost supernatural patience and eyes that could spot a flake of retouching from across the room. She had spent the last decade coaxing secrets out of canvases that everyone else had written off as unimportant, a landscape that turned out to hide a lynching in the background, a still life whose flowers had been painted over a wanted poster for an escaped slave, a family portrait where the black nursemaid, standing in the shadows, had been carefully erased in the 1920s. Elena didn't believe in innocent paintings anymore. She believed in layers. She began, as she always did, with the simplest, least invasive step, examination under natural daylight. She carried the portrait to the tall north-facing windows of the lab and propped it on a foam wedge, and just looked. For 20 silent minutes she circled it, tilting it, squinting, letting her eyes adjust to every nuance of shadow and glare. Something felt wrong immediately. The varnish was too yellow, too thick, as if someone in the early 20th century had slathered on an extra coats to warm up the tones. The craquelure pattern was inconsistent. Some areas showed the fine, even webbing you expect from natural aging, while others had wider, more dramatic cracks that looked almost staged. And the boy's face. The longer she stared, the more the smile began to feel like a mask pulled too tight. Next came the raking light. Elena switched off the overhead fluorescence, angled a narrow beam across the surface, and the painting suddenly revealed its topography, ridges where impasto had been flattened by relining, depressions where the canvas had sagged against old stretcher bars, and, most intriguingly, a faint rectangular outline about 2 inches inside the painted edge, as if something had once been attached to the front of the canvas and later removed. She made a note, then another note when she spotted microscopic dots of darker paint along the boy's neck that didn't quite match the surrounding flesh tones. By the end of the first day, she had taken 400 macro photographs and filled 6 pages of observations, but she had not touched the surface with anything stronger than a squirrel hair brush. Conservation is a discipline of restraint. The canvas can only be stripped of its history once, and there are no do-overs. Day 2 brought the ultraviolet lamp. Under black light, the painting transformed into a ghostly negative. The varnish fluoresced a sickly orange, but here and there patches glowed brighter, almost white, indicating areas of later restoration. More alarming were the dark, non-fluorescing shapes that materialized like bruises, broad bands across the shoulders, a circle around the throat, and 2 parallel lines across each wrist. They were completely invisible in normal light, submerged beneath overpaint and grime, but under UV they looked like the scars of something metallic that had once pressed against tender skin. Elena felt the small hairs on her arms rise. She had seen those shapes before, in photographs of enslaved children wearing iron collars and cuffs for disciplinary portraits. But this portrait had been sold for years as a white child. She told herself it was probably just coincidence, maybe shadows cast by a necklace that had later been painted out. Still, she took another 300 photographs and emailed them to the museum's senior paintings conservator with the subject line, "Please tell me I'm imagining this." She wasn't. Day 4 was solvent testing day. Elena laid the painting face up on the vacuum table, donned nitrile gloves and a respirator, and began rolling tiny cotton swabs moistened with increasingly aggressive mixtures across a 2mm patch in the lower right corner where the background was darkest, and any damage would be least noticeable. The first swabs came away tinged with brown, centuries of soot and nicotine. The next swabs lifted yellowed varnish. Then, on the 7th swab, the cotton turned the color of dried blood. Under the microscope she saw flecks of vermilion and something that looked suspiciously like lead white mixed with a translucent brown lake pigment. Someone had deliberately aged the painting or hidden something beneath artificial dirt. She expanded the test area. 10 minutes later she exposed a sliver of bright emerald green where the draped fabric in the background should have been a muted olive. The original color was vivid, almost electric, the kind of expensive pigment reserved for the most prestigious commissions. Whoever had paid for this portrait had not been stingy. Another 10 minutes and she uncovered a thin black line curving beneath the boy's collar, a line that had no amount of artistic license could explain away as shadow or fold of fabric. Elena stopped. She sat back on her stool, pulled off her gloves, and stared at the tiny window of truth she had opened. Then she did something she almost never did. She swore out loud in the empty lab. The controlled cleaning began in earnest. Working under a binocular microscope at 40 magnification, she moved in a grid pattern no wider than a fingernail, rolling, rinsing, rolling again. The grime came off in delicate curls that she preserved on glass slides for later analysis. With every square millimeter she uncovered, the portrait grew younger, brighter, and infinitely more disturbing. The velvet suit regained its original crimson intensity, so saturated it seemed wet. The lace at the cuffs turned out to be real gold thread, not the painted imitation everyone had assumed. The leather-bound book revealed an embossed crest that had been completely obscured, a crest that belonged to the Claiborne family of Mobile, one of the wealthiest slave-trading dynasties in Alabama. But it was the boy's neck that stole her breath. As the discolored varnish dissolved, a narrow band of dull iron appeared, encircling his throat like a necklace from hell. The painter had depicted every link, every rivet, every place where the metal had rubbed the skin raw. The collar had been painted the exact color of the boy's flesh, so that once the surface was dirtied and yellowed, it would vanish completely. A perfect optical illusion designed to last a century or more. Elena worked for 14 hours straight, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, until the collar was fully exposed. Then she moved to the wrists. Beneath the pristine lace cuffs were matching iron manacles, so delicately rendered they could have been mistaken for bracelets, except for the chain that connected them and disappeared beneath the velvet sleeve. The painter had used the skill of a master and the conscience of a monster. At 3:17 a.m., alone in the lab with only the hum of the ventilation system for company, Elena turned the painting over. The back of the canvas had been relined twice, once in the 1890s and again in the 1940s, each new layer of fabric glued over the original with animal hide glue that had since cracked and yellowed. Between the two relinings, barely visible under raking light, were words scratched into the original canvas with something sharp, maybe a nail or a slave tag stylus. Elena angled her lamp and read, "Property of J.H. Claiborne, born 1851, fancy, light, healthy, to be sold with portrait, New Orleans, March 1855. She sat down hard on the floor, the painting propped against her knees, and cried without sound for a long time. The next morning she spent documenting every new revelation. High-resolution multispectral imaging revealed even more, underdrawing in charcoal that showed the boy originally positioned standing, not seated, with his mother's hand on his shoulder, a hand that had been painted out so thoroughly that only the faintest pentimento remained. Infrared reflectography picked up an earlier signature in the lower left corner, almost obliterated, W. A. Walker, Mobile, 1854. William Aiken Walker, the same itinerant artist famous for his later genre scenes of sharecroppers and cotton pickers, had painted this child when he was still willing to take commissions from slave traders. Walker had been 20 years old, hungry for work, and apparently willing to do whatever was asked of him. By the end of the week, the entire painting had been cleaned down to the first varnish layer applied by the artist himself. The boy's eyes, once soft and dreamy, now burned with a clarity that felt accusatory. The smile was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer sweet. It was the smile of a child who had been told, "If you cry, they will whip your mama," and had decided, at the age of 4, to be brave. Elena's final report was 87 pages long. She included side-by-side photographs, the painting as it had appeared for 160 years, smiling innocently under its coat of lies, and the painting as it appeared now, stripped bare, the iron collar gleaming dully against porcelain skin, the manacles stark against lace, the eyes looking straight into the camera as if to say, "You took your time." When the report landed on the desk of the museum director, he read it once, closed the folder, and stared out the window for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and cancelled every other acquisition meeting for the month. This portrait, he said, was going to rewrite everything they thought they knew about how slavery hid in plain sight, but the deepest secret was still waiting, tucked into the hollow of the 19th century stretcher bars, preserved like an insect in amber, was a folded scrap of paper no larger than a postage stamp. It had been missed during both times the canvas was relined, because the paper had been glued flat against the wood and then painted over to match. Elena found it only because one corner had curled loose during cleaning. When she carefully lifted it with tweezers and unfolded it under the microscope, she found 3 lines written in faded brown ink. His name is Thomas. He likes to sing. Do not let them forget. No signature, no date. Just those 8 words, written by someone, maybe the artist, maybe the mother, maybe another enslaved person in the studio, who knew exactly what this portrait was meant to do and refused to let the child disappear completely. Elena photographed the note, sealed it in an archival envelope, and added one final line to her report. The boy in the painting has been smiling at us for 170 years, waiting for someone to finally see the chains, and now we doth. The boy's name was Thomas, not Master Tommy, not Fancy Boy number 17, not the string of auction lot numbers that would be branded onto his life over the next decade. His mother called him Thomas, after her own father, who had been sold away from a Virginia tobacco farm when she was 7. She whispered it to him in the dark of the slave cabin, rocking him against her chest, while the pine knot fire spat and the January wind found every crack in the walls. Thomas, a Bible name, a free name, a name that belonged to a person, not property. He was born on a raw, wet night in February 1851, sometime between the 2nd and 3rd crowing of the rooster, in a 1-room quarter on the Claiborne cotton plantation 10 miles outside Greensboro, Alabama. The midwife was an older woman named Aunt Sylvie, who had delivered half the enslaved children in Hale County, and who muttered, as she tied off the cord with boiled twine, "This one too light. They gon' come for him quick." Rose, the mother, was 19, small-boned, with skin the color of dark honey and eyes that had already seen too much. She had been brought to the Claiborne place 2 years earlier from a rice plantation on the Pedee River in South Carolina, sold away from her own mother for the crime of being pretty. The man who bought her was James H. Claiborne himself, 34 years old, heir to 3,000 acres and 400 human beings, a man who kept meticulous ledgers and who noticed immediately that Rose's features were fine and her skin several shades lighter than most field hands. He noticed, and he acted on it. Thomas's father was never spoken of openly. Everyone on the place knew, though. The baby's tight curls, the hazel eyes that turned gold in sunlight, the nose too narrow for full African ancestry, those were Claiborne traits. James Claiborne's mother had been a Fairfax from Virginia, and the same blood that gave him his thin lips and long fingers had been forced into Rose 9 months before Thomas drew breath. The master never acknowledged the child, not in speech, not in the plantation books. In the ledger he was entered simply as male, light, healthy, Roses. But privately, Claiborne watched the baby with the cold calculation of a man appraising a promising colt. By the time Thomas was 2, the whispers had already started. Drivers and overseers passing through the yard would pause at the fence rail, squint at the toddler clinging to Rose's skirt, and mutter, "That one gon' bring a pretty penny in New Orleans." Rose heard them. Every time she did, her hands tightened on whatever she was holding, a hoe, a laundry paddle, her child, until her knuckles went pale. She began singing to him constantly, low spirituals and fragments of songs she half remembered from South Carolina, anything to fill his ears with something gentler than the future that was already stalking him. When he was 3, they took him away from her for the first time. It was late summer, the cotton almost ready for picking, the air so thick with heat it felt like breathing syrup. 2 white men arrived in a fancy carriage with Claiborne's crest on the door. One was Claiborne himself, the other a stranger wearing a silk waistcoat and carrying a leather portfolio. They went straight to the big house, stayed 2 hours, then walked down to the quarters with the overseer. Rose was boiling clothes in the yard. She saw them coming and dropped the paddle into the suds. Thomas was playing nearby with a stick and a corncob horse. Claiborne pointed. The stranger opened the portfolio and began sketching rapidly while the overseer hauled Thomas up by one arm. Rose screamed once, a sound that brought every person within earshot to their cabin doors, but no one moved. You did not move when the master was doing business. They kept Thomas in the big house for 6 days. Rose was allowed to bring his meals, cornmeal mush, and a little molasses, but was not permitted to stay. She would set the bowl on the floor outside the parlor door, kneel, and try to catch a glimpse of her child through the crack. Sometimes she heard him crying. Sometimes she heard the stranger coaxing, "Smile for me, little man. Show me those pretty teeth. That's it. Hold the flower just so." On the 3rd day they dressed him in a white linen shirt that hung to his knees. On the 5th day they put real shoes on him, soft leather that pinched his feet and made him walk like a marionette. Rose pressed her face to the floorboards and begged God to let her die instead. When they brought him back to the quarters, he was wearing the burgundy velvet suit. The jacket was too big, the sleeves turned back in thick cuffs, but the color made his skin look almost white. His hair had been oiled and curled with a hot iron. The burns on his scalp were still raw. He clung to Rose's neck and would not speak for 2 days. On the 3rd day he asked, in a voice so small it broke her, "Mama, why they want me to smile when I sad?" She had no answer that a 3-year-old could carry. The portrait session with William Aiken Walker took place in Mobile in the winter of 1854–55, when Thomas was almost 4. Claiborne had decided the boy was ready for the New Orleans market the following spring and wanted a first-class advertisement. Walker, still young and struggling, accepted the commission without hesitation. The studio was on Dauphin Street, above a dry goods store that smelled of coffee and indigo. For 3 weeks Thomas was kept in a room behind the studio, fed well, bathed daily, and taught to sit still for hours at a time. Walker worked quickly, racing against the child's limited patience and Claiborne's impatience. He painted the velvet suit from a bolt of cloth Claiborne provided. The lace was real, imported from France. The rose was replaced daily so it would always look fresh. The iron collar and manacles were left on beneath the clothing the entire time, hidden by high collars and careful folds of fabric, but their weight kept Thomas's posture exactly where Walker wanted it, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. Walker was a good draftsman. He caught the exact curve of the boy's cheek, the way his lower lip was slightly fuller than the upper, the scattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose that only appeared in strong sunlight. He also caught something else, a flicker of exhaustion in the eyes that no amount of coaxing could erase. Walker painted it anyway. Later, when he became famous for his sympathetic depictions of black sharecroppers, he never spoke of this early commission. Perhaps he couldn't. Thomas's last memory of his mother was the morning they loaded him into the wagon for New Orleans. Rose had been allowed to walk with him as far as the main road. She pressed something into his hand, a tiny cowrie shell she had carried since Africa was still a whisper in her mother's stories. "Keep this in your mouth when you scared," she told him. "It tastes like home." Then the overseer cracked the whip in the air, not touching her but close enough that she flinched, and Thomas was lifted into the wagon bed beside crates of Claiborne cotton marked for export. He turned to wave, but Rose had already been pushed to her knees in the dust. The last thing he saw of her was the hem of her skirt disappearing as the driver flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. The journey took 9 days. Thomas rode in the open, chained to the wagon side at night, given water once a day and hardtack when the driver remembered. Somewhere outside Mobile he lost one of the velvet shoes. No one replaced it. By the time they reached the slave pens behind the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, his feet were raw and the velvet suit was gray with road dust. The traders there scrubbed him roughly, rubbed lemon juice into his curls to make them shine, and dressed him in a fresh white shirt for display. The portrait, cleaned, varnished and framed in gilt, was hung on the wall behind the auction block so that every potential buyer could see exactly what kind of fancy article was being offered. The auction was held on March 17, 1855. The auctioneer's catalogue described Lot 28 as a bright fancy boy, 4 years old, warranted sound and healthy, of superior intelligence, light complexion nearly white, accustomed to house service, with oil portrait by a distinguished artist, the whole to be sold together as one lot. Bidding opened at $800 and climbed rapidly. Men in frock coats and beaver hats leaned forward, eyes sharp. One asked to see the boy's teeth. Another ran a hand down his arm, as if testing the ripeness of fruit. Thomas stood on the block in his stocking feet, clutching the cowrie shell in his fist so tightly that the edges cut his palm. When the hammer finally fell at $1,250, an astronomical sum, he did not cry. He had learned already used up every tear on the road from Alabama. The man who bought him was Etienne Rousseau, a sugar planter from St. James Parish, Louisiana. Rousseau renamed him Jupiter because he said the boy had eyes like planets. He was carried upriver in the hold of a steamboat, chained below decks with 20 other new purchases. Somewhere near Donaldsonville, the cowrie shell slipped through a crack in the planking and was lost to the Mississippi. Thomas, now Jupiter, never saw his mother again. Rose was sold herself the following year to a plantation in Texas and died of cholera in 1859. She was 27 years old. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave beside the Brazos River. But the portrait lived on. It traveled with Rousseau to Louisiana, hung in the dining room of Belrive Plantation, where it was admired by guests who never guessed the truth. After the Civil War, it was sold as part of the bankrupt estate, bought by a Union officer who thought the boy looked like his dead son. It passed through attics and auction houses and private collections, smiling sweetly, hiding its chains beneath 160 years of grime and forgetting, until the day Elena Marquez rolled the first solvent swab across the canvas, and the iron collar began to gleam again. Thomas's descendants, people who carry his cheekbones and his hazel eyes, still live in Louisiana and Mississippi. They did not know his story until 2023, when a genealogist working with the Smithsonian matched their DNA to the boy in the portrait. When they were invited to Washington to see it for the first time, his great-great-granddaughter, a woman named LaToya Williams, stood in front of the painting for a long time without speaking. Then she reached out and touched the canvas, very gently, right over the place where the collar would have pressed against his throat. "He's still smiling," she said, voice cracking. "After everything they did to him, he's still smiling. That ain't weakness, that's power." And for the first time in 170 years, Thomas's smile looked like what it had always been, not an advertisement, not a lie, a promise that one day someone would finally see him. The steamboat Princess nosed into the landing at Belrive Plantation just after sunrise on a morning, so still the river looked like polished glass. Thomas, now called Jupiter by everyone who owned the right to name him, stood on the lower deck with the other new purchases, his wrists still linked by a short length of chain that had rubbed the skin raw during the night. The air smelled of wet earth, cane smoke, and something sweet rotting he could not yet identify. Etienne Rousseau was waiting on the levee in a white linen suit and Panama hat, smoking a thin cigar, flanked by an overseer named Thibodeau, who carried a coiled whip the way other men carried walking sticks. Rousseau did not speak to the child directly. He simply nodded once at Thibodeau, and the overseer cut the chain between Thomas's cuffs with a pair of heavy shears, leaving the iron bracelets themselves locked in place. "Houseboy," Rousseau said, as if tasting the words. "We'll see." They marched the new people up the shell road between rows of slave cabins that looked, to Thomas's exhausted eyes, exactly like the ones he had left behind in Alabama, only larger and newer. The only difference was the silence. No children ran out to stare, no dogs barked. Even the chickens seemed to move quietly. Later he would learn that Belrive had a reputation. People sent here either broke quickly or died trying not to. Thomas was taken first to the laundry yard behind the kitchen, stripped, scrubbed with lye soap until his skin burned, then doused with a bucket of cold water that made him gasp so hard he thought his chest would crack. An older woman named Tante Marie, who had a long scar from ear to collarbone, rubbed hog fat into the sores on his wrists and told him in French patois, "You keep your eyes down and your mouth sweet, garçon. That's how you live long enough to hate them proper." She dressed him in a clean Osnaburg shirt that reached his knees and nothing else. The velvet suit, the lace, the single remaining shoe, everything from the portrait, was gone, folded away into a trunk that would eventually find its way back to Rousseau's attic and, a century later, to auction houses and private collections, still carrying the faint scent of river water and terror. For the first year, Thomas lived in the big house itself, sleeping on a pallet outside Madame Rousseau's dressing-room door like a dog. His duties were simple but endless: carry fans, fill water pitchers, stand motionless holding a silver tray of lemonade, while the family played cards in the sweltering afternoons, follow the youngest Rousseau daughter, Camille, aged 6, wherever she went, so she would never be without someone to blame if she spilled something or tore her dress. Camille called him "my Jupiter," and liked to twist his ears when no one was looking. Once, when he flinched, she slapped him so hard his lip split. Madame Rousseau watched from her rocking chair, smiled thinly and said, "He'll learn." He did. After that he never flinched again, not where they could see. Rousseau was not a screamer like some planters Thomas had heard about. He preferred silence. When he was displeased, he simply looked at a person until they began to tremble. Then he walked away. The trembling was punishment enough, but he was meticulous. Every evening he sat at a mahogany desk in the library and wrote in a ledger bound in red Morocco leather the weight of cane ground that day, the number of barrels of sugar shipped, the cost of feed, the price paid for each new human being, and, in the margin, small notes about behavior. Against Thomas's name, the first entry read, "Light fancy, 1250, healthy, quick to smile when prompted." The second entry, 3 weeks later, "Still wets the bed. Have Tante Marie switch him." The third, 2 months after that, "Smile less mechanical, useful. Thomas learned the house the way a rat learns a trap, every loose floorboard, every back stair that did not creak, every key that hung on the rack in the butler's pantry. He learned which floorboards in the dining room squeaked so he could freeze mid-step when Rousseau lifted a finger for silence. He learned to pour coffee without spilling a drop, even when Camille deliberately jostled his elbow. He learned to lace Madame's corset so tight she could barely breathe, because if she fainted it would be his fault, and every night, when the house finally slept, he lay on his pallet and pressed the place where the cowrie shell used to be against his chest, trying to remember the taste of salt and Mama's voice, but the memory thinned a little more each week, until it felt like something that had happened to another boy. When he turned 8, in the winter of 1859, they moved him out of the house and into the Garconniere, a small brick building behind the kitchen garden where the older houseboys slept. The iron cuffs finally came off, his wrists had outgrown them, but the scars remained, pale rings he would carry for the rest of his life. His new job was to wait table at dinner, stand behind Rousseau's chair during meetings with factors and commission merchants, and, most importantly, be clean and silent and beautiful while white men discussed the price of flesh over brandy and cigars. Sometimes a guest would reach out and pinch his cheek or run a thumb across his curls and say, "Fine stock, Rousseau. You breed him yourself?" Rousseau would laugh softly and say nothing, but his eyes always flicked to Thomas, measuring the war came slowly to Belle Rive, the way a fever creeps in. First, there were fewer steamboats on the river. Then the overseers began carrying rifles instead of whips. Then the field hands started singing different songs at night, low and coded songs about Moses and Pharaoh that made the white people nervous. Thomas listened from the shadows of the kitchen yard, storing every word the way a squirrel stores acorns. In the spring of 1862, a Union gunboat shelled the levee 2 miles downriver, and everyone thought the Yankees were coming, but they never did. Rousseau moved his silver and his wife's jewelry into a hole under the library floor and made Thomas help dig it at midnight, promising 20 lashes for every piece that clinked. Thomas dug so carefully the spoons might have been sleeping babies. In November 1863, the news reached Belle Reve that Vicksburg had fallen. Rousseau got drunk for the first time anyone could remember and shot his favorite hunting dog in the yard because it barked at the moon. The next morning he ordered every enslaved person over 12 lined up in front of the sugar house and told them that if any one of them tried to run, he would burn the quarters to the ground with the children inside. Thomas was 12 by then, tall for his age, and he stood in the back row watching Rousseau's hands shake as he reloaded the pistol. That was the moment he understood the man was afraid. Freedom, when it finally came, arrived without trumpets. One morning in June 1865, a column of blue-coated soldiers rode up the Shell Road led by a captain with a red beard and tired eyes. Rousseau met them on the gallery in his dressing gown, still holding the red ledger. The captain read from a paper declaring all persons held as slaves immediately and forever free, then asked politely if Monsieur Rousseau required assistance burying his dog. Rousseau went inside, locked the library door, and shot himself through the mouth. The sound was not loud. Thomas was polishing silver in the pantry and thought at first someone had dropped a tray. After that, everything unraveled quickly. The soldiers took the horses and the mules and most of the food. Madame Rousseau and Camille left for New Orleans with 2 trunks and no servants. The field hands walked off the place singing. Thomas stayed. He had nowhere to go and no way to get there. For 3 months Belle Reve stood half empty, windows broken, weeds growing through the brick walks, while Thomas lived in the big house alone, eating from the pantry and sleeping in Rousseau's bed because it was the softest thing he had ever touched. Eventually a Freedmen's Bureau agent found him there, a thin black man from Ohio who wore spectacles and spoke softly. He wrote Thomas's name in a ledger of his own, Thomas Claiborne, age 14, orphan, literate because Tante Marie had risked her life teaching him letters by candlelight, and told him he could take the Rousseau surname if he wanted, or any name at all. Thomas thought for a long time. Then he said, "Just Thomas." The agent wrote it down and handed him a scrap of paper that said he was free. Thomas folded it into a square so small it fit inside the scar on his wrist where the cuff had been. He drifted for the next decade, sharecropping on the old Belle Reve land when white men would rent to him, working the levee in New Orleans when they wouldn't, laying railroad track up near Shreveport, following the harvest north to the cotton country in Mississippi. Everywhere he went, people remarked on his light skin and straight features and asked if he was from the house. He never answered. He saved every penny, bought 10 acres of scrubland outside Natchez in 1877, built a one-room cabin with his own hands, and planted pecan trees that would outlive him by a century. In 1882 he married a quiet woman named Violet, who had been born free in Ohio and come south to teach school. They had 7 children, 6 of whom lived. Thomas never spoke much about the years before freedom, not even to Violet. When the children asked about the pale circles on his wrists, he told them he'd been bitten by a cottonmouth as a boy, and the snake's teeth had left perfect rings. They believed him because children believe their fathers, and because the lie was gentler than the truth. He worked the little farm until his hands were more scar than skin, raised his children to read and to vote and to look white men in the eye. Every spring he planted a row of red roses along the fence line because once, long ago, someone had told him to hold a rose and smile. The roses grew thick and wild, and people driving past on the Natchez Trace would slow down to look at the old man in patched overalls tending flowers like they were gold. Thomas died on a February morning in 1937, 86 years old, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. The pecan trees were tall enough now to throw shade across the whole acres. His youngest daughter, Esther, found him there at dusk, eyes open, staring at the horizon as if waiting for a steamboat that would never come. In his pocket was the tiny square of paper the Freedmen's Bureau agent had given him 72 years earlier, worn so thin it felt like cloth. Esther kept it in her Bible until she died, then passed it to her daughter, and so on, until it reached Latoya Williams in 2023, who carried it in her purse the day she stood in front of the cleaned portrait at the Smithsonian and finally met the smiling boy who had been her great-great-grandfather. Latoya unfolded the fragile square under the museum lights, read the single word Thomas, and understood why in every family photograph after 1865 he never smiled with his teeth. The smile in the portrait, the one that had fooled collectors and curators for 160 years, had not been joy. It had been the last order he ever obeyed. After June 1865 he was done taking orders about what his face should do, and yet when Latoya looked at the painting that day, cleaned of every lie, the boy's eyes still held something fierce and undefeated. Not happiness, maybe, but survival and memory. And a refusal, quiet as dawn on the river, to let them write the ending of his story. Thomas had kept the promise he made to himself the night Rousseau put the pistol in his mouth and the world cracked open. They could take his name, his mother, his childhood, 12 years of his life, and every single tear he had left to cry, but they would never take that smile away from him again. He simply chose to give it back on his own terms when he was ready to the people who finally deserved to see it. The portrait hangs today on the 3rd floor of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., in a gallery whose walls are the color of river silt after rain. It is no longer the sweet, sleepy painting that once graced Connecticut fireplaces and Virginia auction catalogs. The grime is gone. The yellow varnish is gone. The lies are gone. What remains is stark, almost unbearably vivid. A 4-year-old child in a blood-red velvet suit, wrists and throat circled by dull iron, eyes looking straight into the lens of history with a knowledge no child should possess. The smile is still there, but it has changed shape. It is smaller now, tighter, the smile of someone who has been told exactly what will happen if he lets it fall. The Smithsonian installed the painting in 2023, after 2 years of deliberation about how and whether to show something this brutal. They placed it at the end of a long corridor, lined with other antebellum portraits, stiff white planters in black coats, pale wives in silk and lace, children who never had to wonder if tomorrow they would still belong to their mothers. Those portraits are hung high, the way they were meant to be seen, from a position of ownership. Thomas's portrait hangs lower, at a child's eye level, so that every visitor must bend or kneel to meet his gaze. The wall label is short and merciless. Thomas, later called Jupiter, born enslaved, Hale County, Alabama, 1851, commissioned by enslaver James H. Claiborne as an advertisement for sale. Oil on canvas, William Aiken Walker, Mobile, 1854–55. Gift of the descendants of Etienne Rousseau and Conservation Acquisition Fund. Beside the painting, in a shallow case lit like a reliquary, rests the actual iron collar that was painted from life, a narrow band of hand-forged iron, the rivets still sharp enough to draw blood if you press too hard. Next to it is the tiny folded note Elena Marquez found inside the stretcher. His name is Thomas. He likes to sing. Do not let them forget. The paper is so fragile now that it is preserved between 2 sheets of ultraviolet filtering glass, yet every letter is still legible, written in brown ink that might be blood, might be sweat, might be both. On the opening day of the new installation, more than 70 people who share Thomas's DNA arrived by bus, by plane, by car from Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Ohio, California. They ranged in age from 4 months to 93 years. Some had never met before. Others had grown up hearing only rumors of a fancy boy in the family tree no one wanted to talk about. They gathered in the gallery at 10 in the morning when the museum was still closed to the public and stood in a loose semicircle while Latoya Williams, great-great-granddaughter, school principal, keeper of the worn Freedmen's Bureau paper, read the names of every ancestor she could trace back to Thomas and Rose. When she reached his mother's name, Rose, born about 1832, died of cholera in Texas, 1859, the room filled with the soft sound of people breathing in at the same time, as if the air itself had decided to remember. Then they turned off the overhead lights. A single spotlight came up on the painting, and for a long minute no one spoke. A little boy of 6, wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, walked straight up to the canvas, stood on tiptoe, and placed his palm flat against the glass as if he could push through time and take the child's hand. His mother started to pull him back, but Latoya stopped her. "Let him," she said. "He's just saying hello to his granddaddy." The boy stayed there until a docent gently explained that the glass was there to protect both of them. He nodded solemnly, then turned to the rest of the family and announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "He looks like my daddy when he was little." Several people laughed through sudden tears. Later, when the museum opened to the public, the gallery filled quickly, people who had come expecting the usual icons. Harriet Tubman's hymn book, Emmett Till's casket, the Greensboro lunch counter stools, found themselves stopped dead by a painting they had never heard of. They read the label, looked at the collar, read the note, and then stood in front of Thomas for a long time. Some cried openly. Some took photographs, hands shaking. One white woman in her 70s clothing stood so long her daughter finally touched her elbow and whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" The woman answered, voice cracking, "I grew up with a painting just like this in my grandmother's dining room. Same velvet suit, same rose, I never knew." Within a week, the museum had to assign extra guards to the gallery full-time, not because anyone was misbehaving, but because visitors kept reaching out to touch the canvas, as if the boy might feel their fingertips across the centuries and know he was no longer alone. Security reported that the most common phrase overheard was some variation of, "I'm sorry." Sometimes it was whispered, sometimes sobbed, sometimes spoken in languages the guards did not recognize, but whose meaning was unmistakable. School groups became a special challenge. The education department rewrote their third-floor tour script 3 times, struggling to find words that honored the truth without traumatizing 8-year-olds. In the end, they settled on honesty wrapped in care. This little boy was stolen from his mother and forced to wear iron so he couldn't run. The man who owned him had this picture painted to sell him, the way you might sell a horse. But the boy kept his name secret and kept singing inside his head, and because he did, we know who he really was today. Teachers reported that children listened in perfect silence, something that almost never happened anywhere else in the museum. One 5th grader from Anacostia raised her hand and asked, "Did they ever catch the bad man who did this?" The guide answered, "Some of them, yes, but a lot of them just died old and rich. That's part of why we have to keep looking at this picture, so we remember what they did and what we still have to fix." The girl nodded once, the way children do when they have just shouldered something too heavy but refuse to put it down. Online, the painting spread faster than the curators expected. Within days, it was everywhere. Instagram stories with crying emojis, TikToks stitching the before and after conservation photos to the sound of Nina Simone's "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free," Twitter threads listing every museum that still owns similar fancy child portraits without adequate explanation. A meme appeared showing Thomas side by side with the viral Success Kid fist pump image, captioned, "When you survive American slavery and your face still ends up on a museum wall scaring white people into decency." It was shared 400 times before someone finally added the comment, "He's not scaring us, he's waking us." Artists responded the way artists do. A mural went up on U Street showing Thomas life-size, collar broken open, roses growing out of the iron links. A New Orleans brass band recorded a second-line version of the lullaby Rose used to sing. Someone had found the tune in an enslaved woman's diary in Tulane's archives and played it outside the museum on Juneteenth. Beyoncé's creative team quietly requested high-resolution files for a future project. The museum said yes. Conservative commentators predictably called the display divisive, accused the Smithsonian of race-baiting with dead children, claimed the collar was a forgery, insisted the entire story was woke propaganda. The museum posted the conservation report, 87 pages, 400 macro photographs, spectral imaging charts, and let the science speak. The critics went quiet or moved on to new outrage. Inside the gallery itself, something quieter was happening. Visitors began leaving things. First it was notes slipped into the comment box. "Thank you for surviving so I could exist. I will teach my sons your real name." Then flowers appeared, single red roses laid at the base of the frame every morning before opening, even though the museum has no flower shop and no one saw who brought them. The staff stopped removing them. Instead, they replaced the water every night and let the petals fall where they would until the carpet looked like a garden after battle. Someone left a tiny cowrie shell. Someone else left a child's drawing of a boy with wings made of iron that had turned into butterflies. A 90-year-old veteran in a purple heart cap left his challenge coin. By the end of the first year, the museum had filled 3 archival boxes with offerings. They created a 4th. The roses became a ritual. Every Friday at closing time, a museum employee gathers whatever fresh ones remain, wraps them in damp paper towels and plastic, and drives them to the cemetery in Natchez, where Thomas and Violet lie side by side under a pecan tree. The groundskeeper there, a descendant himself, places the flowers on the grave and waters them from a tin bucket that once belonged to his great-aunt Esther. He says the roses last longer than any others, sometimes weeks past when they should have withered. Back in the gallery, the light over the painting is kept low to protect the pigments, but never so low that you can't see Thomas's eyes. On slow weekday afternoons, when the crowds thin out, the guards say you can hear him if you stand still enough. The faintest thread of melody, 3 notes repeating like a heartbeat. No one has ever recorded it successfully. Phones die, microphones pick up nothing but silence. But the people who work there swear it's the same 3 notes every time. The opening phrase of the lullaby Rose sang the night Thomas was born. The museum added a small plaque beneath the note in the case. It reads, "He liked to sing, 'We are still listening,' and beneath that, in letters almost too small to read unless you kneel the way Thomas's descendants did that first morning, the curators placed a line from the poet Lucille Clifton. "Come celebrate with me that every day. Something has tried to kill me and has failed." Visitors read it, look up at the child who should never have survived long enough to become an old man tending roses, and understand that the smile in the portrait is not forgiveness. It is evidence. Evidence that the child refused to let them define the shape of his soul. Evidence that memory, carried in blood and song and stubborn refusal to forget, is stronger than iron. Evidence that every time a new pair of eyes meets his across the glass, the sale is cancelled again, the collar falls again, the name Thomas is spoken again in a place where once only silence was allowed. The portrait is no longer property, it is reunion. It is testimony. It is the sound, soft, continual, unbreakable, of a little boy who liked to sing, still singing, across 2 centuries, to every descendant who walks through the door and finally says his name out loud. And the roses keep coming. The song keeps going. The chains, for the length of one held breath in a quiet museum gallery, weigh nothing at all.